Okay, I feel like I want to respond to Ken's talk because I found it very invigorating and thought-provoking, but I have something a bit different. So the title of my talk, and I'll try not to be too much longer than he was, though I may be a little bit longer. But okay, the title of my talk, for reasons of become apparent, is Parasites on the Body of Capital. Okay. In his science fiction novel Pop Apocalypse, Lee Constantinou imagines the existence of a creative destruction school of Marxist-Leninist thought. The adherents of this school, and this is a quote from the novel, interpret Marx's writings as literal predictions of the future, so they consider it their mission to help capitalist markets spread to every corner of the world because that's the necessary precondition for a truly socialist revolution. This means that the creative destruction Marxists are indistinguishable in terms of actual practice from the most ruthless capitalists. In the novel, their actions coincide with those of a group of investors who have concluded that, another quote, there's money to be made off the destruction of the world, and that in fact apocalyptic destruction constitutes, quote, an unprecedented business opportunity. They therefore seek to precipitate a worldwide nuclear conflagration. Here's another quote. On behalf of our investors, we're obligated to take every step we can to ensure that we corner the apocalypse market before anyone else does. Okay, let's take the satire as a preliminary parable of capitalism and accelerationism. Benjamin Noyes, who actually coined the term accelerationism, as Jean mentioned, does indeed present it somewhat like this, as, and this is Noyes, an exotic variant of la politique du pire. If capitalism generates its own forces of dissolution, then the necessity is to radicalize capitalism itself, the worse the better. But perhaps Noyes' critique is a bit unfair. Acceleration is a new response to the specific conditions of today's neoliberal, globalized, and network capitalism. And I actually, neoliberal is a word which has been overused, but I actually think it's useful. Maybe, hopefully I'll explain that. But it is solidly rooted in traditional Marxist thought. Marx himself writes both of capitalism's revolutionary effects and of the contradictions that render it unviable. On the one hand, Marx and Engels write in the manifesto that capitalism is characterized, and this is a famous quote, constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. Now note the way in this passage that capitalism's relentless revolutionizing of technologies and social relations also revolutionizes our self-understanding. As capitalism shakes up the material basis of life, it also demystifies and disenchants. It destroys all of the old mythical explanations and legitimations that were previously used to justify our place both in society and in the cosmos. We are left, as Ray Brassier puts it, with a world in which intelligibility has become detached from meaning. My difference with Brassier, and also with what Reza was saying last night, on this point is that Brassier and Reza attribute the demystification of old narratives to a supposed normative ideal of explanatory progress, when in fact the real cause of this is, as Marx says, it's a consequence of capitalism's overwhelming development of productive forces. This doesn't mean that science in practice is in any sense arbitrary or socially constructed, but it does suggest that any talk of the alleged power of inferential links in the logical space of reasons is itself little more than a post hoc rationalization, rather than any actual explanation of the way that science works. We ought to be wary, I would argue, as wary of Sallarsian neo-rationalism as we are of the meaning-laden narratives that Brassier so categorically dismisses. But that's just a side note. In any case, Marx refuses to separate the radically liberatory effects of the constant revolutionizing of production from its creation of vast human misery. And I think this is what it means, to me, in a de-Hegelianized way, it's become clear, this is what it means to say that Marx is dialectical. You can't separate those two. Marx insists that these go together precisely because the development of capitalism is beset by severe internal contradictions. These contradictions are both the reason why capitalist development is not benign and why it cannot be the ultimate horizon of history or of technological invention. In particular, Marx emphasizes the violent contradiction between the forces of production unleashed by capitalism and the relations of production that organize it. And this is a familiar thing in 150 years of Marxist discourse. The discordance between these, but here's a famous quote from Capital, which has Marx's, the monopoly of capital becomes a fetter upon the mode of production, which has flourished alongside and under it. The centralization of the means of production and the socialization of labor reach a point at which they become incompatible with their capitalist integument. This integument is burst asunder. The knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated. Now, at the risk of belaboring the obvious, I'll point out that Marx's diagnosis of the maladies of capitalism has been amply confirmed by subsequent events, even though his vision of a movement beyond capitalism has obviously never come to pass, certainly not in the socialist bloc of the 20th century, and even more certainly not in our reality. In today's neoliberal globalized network society, the monopoly of capital has indeed become a fetter upon the mode of production. You can see this in all sorts of ways, and I'll try to skip, but I mean, insane austerity programs transfer more wealth to the already rich at the price of undermining living standards, not to mention spending ability for the population as a whole. The privatization of formerly public services and the expropriation of formerly common resources undermine the very infrastructures that are essential for long-term survival. Digital rights management and copy protection restrict the flow of data and cripple the power of the very digital technologies that make them possible in the first place. Ubiquitous surveillance by both corporate and government entities and the consequent consolidation of big data leads to a stultification at precisely those points where the ruling ideology calls for flexibility and creativity. Investment is increasingly directed towards derivatives and other arcane financial instruments. The more these claim to comprehend the future by pricing risk, the more thoroughly they move away from any grounding in or relation to actual and short-term, much less profitable productive activity. And of course, massive environmental deterioration results from the way that actual energetic expenditures are written off by businesses as so-called externalities. And yet none of these contradictions have caused the system to collapse or even remotely menaced its expanded reproduction. Instead, capitalism perpetuates itself through a continued series of readjustments. Nearly all of us as individuals have suffered from these blockages and degradations, but capital itself has not. Despite the fact that we have reached a point where capitalist property relations have become an onerous fetter upon the mode of production that they initially helped to put into motion, this fetter shows no sign of being lifted. The intensification of capitalism's contradictions, in Marxist terms, has not led to an explosion or to any negation of the negation. The capitalist integument has failed to burst asunder. Instead, it has calcified into a rigid carapace, well-nigh suffocating the life within. So I think accelerationism is best understood as an attempt to respond to this dilemma. On the one hand, we have massive dialectical contradictions that nonetheless do not lead to any sublation or negation of the negation, such as Marx, in this respect at least, all too faithfully following Hegel envisioned. On the other hand, and at the same time, and I think it's important to insist upon this, actually existing capitalism has in fact brought us to the point where, perhaps for the first time in human history since the invention of agriculture, such a supersession is at least conceivable. With its globe-spanning technologies, its creation and use of an incredibly powerful computation and communications infrastructure, its mobilization of general intellect, and its machinic automation of irksome toil, contemporary capitalism really has produced the conditions for universal affluence. In the world today, there's already enough accumulated wealth and sufficiently advanced technology for every human being to lead a life of leisure and self-cultivation. As William Gibson famously said, the future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. We should not underestimate the significance of this. In principle, at least, even if not in fact, we have actually solved the economic problem. And I'm taking these terms not from a Marxist, but from John Maynard Keynes, writing in 1930. Keynes predicted that within a century, we would have solved the economic problem. This means, Keynes added, that the economic problem is not, if we look in the future, the permanent problem of the human race. Rather, it's something different. Keynes writes, for the first time since his creation, man will be faced with his permanent problem. How to use his freedom from pressing economic cares, how to occupy his leisure, which science and compound interest will have won for him, to live wisely and agreeably and well. What the Bloomsbury aesthete Keynes foresaw as the outcome of capitalism, assuming, of course, the euthanasia of the rentier, which Keynes hoped would happen gradually and without a revolution, this vision differs very little from the socialism imagined by such people as Charles Fourier and Oscar Wilde, among others. Fourier and Wilde both saw general affluence as the necessary condition for human beings to be able to flourish, cultivating their individuality and their passions. Keynes's vision is not even all that far off from the communism described by the young Marx himself, a society in which, another famous quote from Marx, makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming a hunter, fisherman, shepherd, or critic. Okay, so I think there's a lot to say in favor of this kind of 19th century idea of, aesthetic leisurely cultivation. And I'd suggest that you can draw a genealogy of this, which comes from the 19th century through in the 20th century, someone like Foucault. There's actually a whole gay male subculture thing going back to Wilde and stretching through Foucault, which does this. But I think you can extend it from that to ideas we have now about the post-human. I think the post-human, which is much talked about, only really makes sense in terms of this kinds of leisurely aesthetic self-cultivation. But of course, we don't really have the conditions in theory, but not in practice. The rentier has not gradually faded away, nor has the capitalist organization of production been overturned either by reform or by revolutionary upheaval. In other words, the Hegelian dialectic has definitively failed. The real is unquestionably not rational. Hegelian dialectics is not adequate to describe the delirious, irrational logic of capital, even though Marx himself originally analyzed it with Hegelian categories. For our experiences of the past century have taught us that in the worst, The worse its own internal contradictions get, the more fully capitalism is empowered. Marx wrote that capital is dead labor, which vampire-like only lives by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks. But in fact, capital is even more monstrous than this, for it is actively auto-cannibalistic. It feeds not only on living labor, but also upon itself, or upon the congealed dead labor which it is. As David Harvey reminds us, Marx envisions, and this is Harvey quoting Marx, I'm not sure where the passage is in Marx, but the violent destruction of capital not by relations external to it, but rather as a condition of its own self-preservation. When profit rates decline, then vast conflagrations of value, whether in wars or in economic crises, allow the accumulation of capitalism to resume anew. The lesson is that capitalism is never undone by its own internal contradictions. Rather, capitalism both needs and uses these contradictions. It continually regenerates itself by means of them, and indeed it could not survive without them. In other words, we cannot hope to negate capitalism because capitalism itself mobilizes a far greater negativity than anything we could hope to mount against it. The dirty little secret of capitalism is that it produces abundance, but also continually transforms this abundance into scarcity. It has to do so because it cannot endure its own abundance. Again and again, as Marx and Engels say in the manifesto, there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity, epidemic of overproduction. The wealth that capitalism actually produces undermines the scarcity that remains its raison d'etre. For once scarcity has been overcome, there's nothing left to drive competition. The imperative to expand and intensify production simply becomes absurd in the face of abundance. Therefore, capitalism needs to generate and impose scarcity simply in order to keep itself going. This is the irrational turn that Keynes missed in his all-too-rational hope for capitalists to generate affluence. And I think this, again, leads into the whole question of accelerationism. I mean, I won't quote it again because it's already been quoted. The passage from Deleuze and Guattari about going further in capitalist deterritorialization. It's actually less general and more specific if you look at it in context than it's often quoted to be. But it has to do with again, this kind of process. Capitalism, scarcity under capitalism is never primary, Deleuze and Guattari say, but rather is created, planned, and organized in and through social production. More specifically, they say that scarcity, and this is another quote, is counterproduced as a result of the pressure of anti-production, arising from capital as the socius, as they call it, or a monstrous body without organs of social being. Okay, now I think there are several things. I'm going to skip a little so I don't take too much time. There are several directions you can go with this image of the monstrous body without organs of capital, which you get in Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus. And one is the whole question of scarcity and abundance has to be rethought. And this is something which happens in the history of political economy. The classical political economy of Smith and Ricardo and Marx, and revived by Piero Sraffa in the 20th century, is the question it asks is how if society generates a surplus, how is the surplus used, distributed, reinvested, and so on. That has been totally effaced by the neoclassical marginalist economics which came out in the 1870s and 1880s and which still survives, however sclerotic it is today, which asks again, how do we make decisions in conditions of scarcity? It assumes a primordial scarcity and that's connected with its assuming individual consumers making individual rational choices under constraint. And this is something which needs to be gotten away from. Now, there are several ways to think about this. Actually, Keynes himself, in the same article where he talks about future prosperity of our grandchildren, also talks about there's a difference between material scarcity. Now it is, I'll read the Keynes quote. It is true that the needs of human beings may seem to be insatiable, but they fall into two classes. Those needs which are absolute in the sense that we feel them whatever the situation of our fellow human beings may be, and those which are relative in the sense that we feel them only if their satisfaction lifts us above, makes us feel superior to our fellows. Needs of the second class, those which satisfy the desire for superiority, may indeed be insatiable. For the higher the general level, the higher still are they. But this is not so true of the absolute needs. A point may soon be reached, much sooner perhaps than we all of us are aware of, when these needs are satisfied in the sense that we prefer to devote our further energies to non-economic purposes. So, I mean, that goes back to what I'm saying about self-cultivation. Capitalist neoclassical economics assumes insatiable desire. I mean, it's really more, I need to work on more there, but what I want to suggest is that this aesthetic urge for self-fashioning may provide a different way of thinking about our social and individual desires than the idea of desire as something which is infinite, which is a 19th century romantic thing then brought in the 20th century by a lot of modernism like Bataille. I mean, maybe self-fashioning is an alternative to thinking of desire as infinite and therefore always insatiable. And again, the question of surplus, so again, thinking in terms of surplus instead of in terms of scarcity, I mean, one might think of that in terms of environment also, just in that fact that environmental degradation is caused by these massive externalities. And we might think instead, I mean, again, this is a more positive use of Bataille, but Bataille talks about the generosity of the sun, which gives us an overabundance of energy, most of which we squander. I mean, that's why I'm interested kind of more profoundly in solar energy as a response to environmental issues. But again, all this has to be understood with in connection, I think, back to Marxism. The whole sense of accelerationism only makes sense in terms of this dilemma which Marx, or the failure of Marx's positive predictions, but the fulfillment of his negative visions of what capitalism would do, leaves us with. And I think in fact, almost everything I've said about capitalism earlier in this talk really deals with one of the most controversial and difficult and dubious parts of Marx's theoretical edifice, which is the fall of the rate of profit. And I don't lack the capacity to go into all the arguments that have been made as to whether the rate of profit is actually falling. I'm inclined to think that it is, and that a lot of changes in capitalism are in order to alleviate this. And again, that's arguable, and I don't feel on solid grounds. But I think the important thing about what Marx is talking about is, I mean, he refers to laws, but he also refers to tendencies. So his chapter is the law of the tendential fall of the rate of profit. And excuse my bad German, but it's Gesetz des tendenziellen Falls der Profitrate. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but I mean, tendential is a very unusual word in English. I'm not sure it's quite as unusual in German, but it's an interesting word, and I think it makes sense. It's a tendency. A tendency is something that's real, but not necessarily actual. There are countervailing forces for it, and Marx actually spends more time in Capital Volume 3 talking about the countervailing forces to the tendential law of the law of the tendential fall of the rate of profit than he does of talking about the fall itself. So I think any understanding of this, I think we need to follow the clue about tendential processes. And I mean, I myself tend to link this with Deleuze's ideas about the virtual. And again, the virtual is a very difficult part of Deleuze, one which I have even after 25 years of reading him, I have trouble quite working out. But I think it has to do with, the idea that certain things, I mean, it has to do, I think, with a certain type of futurity. I mean, obviously, we have a situation where neoliberal capitalism tries to completely colonize the future, to turn the future into more of the present. This is done in derivatives through pricing risk and thus getting rid of genuine uncertainty by turning it into risk, which is something that Keynes, as well as anybody of a more left-wing tendency, was very critical of. But that's the capitalist project today. So I think we need to think in terms of a futurity that may be uncertain, that may be uncalculable, that maybe can't be quantified as a percentage of risk. And there are a lot of ways you could go with this. Kent and Meillassoux talking about radical contingency is one way, but Keynes's insistence that future uncertainty was different from risk, which could be calculated, is another. And I think, and I'd link this to two other things. Okay, I don't want to take I think this to two other things. One is that this leads to a kind of failure of imagination, and I'm thinking here again of Mark Fisher's discussion of capitalist realism, and which is the incapacity to imagine anything else than capitalism, or quoting both Zizek and Jameson, allegedly, Fisher talks about that it's easier to imagine the end of the world, imagine this apocalyptic destruction of everything, than to imagine the end of capitalism. And in fact, one might argue that the popularity of end-of-the-world scenarios is precisely because, I mean, as I said when I wrote about Laws of Materials Melancholia, if the world ends, at least we get rid of our credit card debt, which otherwise will haunt us eternally. But anyway, I'd link this also to the sense which I get from Deleuze and Guattari of the monstrous body of capital as this kind of, I mean, this is where Nick Land is coming in with his reading of Deleuze and Guattari, capital as this kind of monstrous alien body from the future, which is colonizing the present. The difference is that Land wants us to become inhumanist by celebrating this kind of invasion from the future of this monstrous alien. To me, this seems a little too much like Stockholm Syndrome. I'd really like to think more about what we can do in the face of this alien invention. And, Land is offering a science fictional account of capitalism, and I think he's right, but I think there are other things we can do with it. And that brings me to the last part of my talk, where I want to talk about what I see. I mean, science fiction deals with what I call the virtual, with potentiality, with capitalism doesn't, I mean, science fiction doesn't literally project the future or predict the future. What it does is it's about the elements of futurity which actually exist or insist in our present in the form of the virtual, the potential, or the tendential. Okay, that's my working definition of science fiction. So I'd like to finish by talking about an interesting science fiction story written in the 1990s by Paul DeFilippo, who's a very prolific science fiction author who lives in Providence, Rhode Island. His story, Phylogenesis, deals directly with this situation. And it is, I think, an accelerationist fiction in the way that it pushes to the end of the full monstrosity of the body of capital, and especially of the ecological catastrophe that is one of that body's consequences. Phylogenesis is a kind of story about living on the face of monstrosity. The literal premise of the short story is that an alien species of enormous invaders, and I have a lot of quotes from that story interwoven in my account. An alien species of enormous invaders came to Earth from space without warning. In blind fulfillment of their life cycle, they sought biomass for conversion to more of their kind. So it's these like enormous aliens, like they're like spheres which are like 10 miles, in diameter. They float through outer space until they come to a new star system, and then they go to the planets and suck up all the biomass. So as a result of their arrival on Earth, the ecosphere had been fundamentally disrupted, damaged beyond repair. The invaders' massive predation leaves the Earth a barren, ruined mass. The planet, once green and blue, now resembled a white, featureless ball, exactly the texture and composition of the invading species itself. Human beings are reluctant to accept the hard truth that they cannot repel the invasion. Only in the final days of the plague, when the remnants of mankind huddled in a few last redoubts, did anyone admit that extermination of the invaders and reclamation of the planet was impossible. The human agenda is reset at the last possible moment. With victory unattainable, sheer survival becomes the only remaining goal. And maybe this can be linked to what Ken was talking about, orderly retreat, though I think it's more pessimistic. In this situation of general dispossession, there is no longer any environment capable of sustaining humanity. It is necessary instead to adopt a new man to the alien conditions, the quote. And so the chromo-sartors get to work, genetically refashioning Homo sapiens into a new species. We are reborn as viral parasites, living within the very bodies of the spacefaring invaders. On the outside, the host presents a smooth surface. It is a tremendous glaucous bulk with skin like a bluish-gray compound of fat and plastic, possessed of a relatively high albedo and shaped like a featureless ovoid. Those are all quotations from the story. The host, just like Deleuze and Guattari's monstrous body without organs, and this is another quote from DeFilippo, presents a smooth, slippery, opaque, taut surface as a barrier. But beneath the surface, Deleuze and Guattari tell us the body without organs senses there are larvae and loathsome worms, so many nails piercing the flesh, so many forms of torture. DeFilippo's version of this, though I don't think he read Anti-Oedipus, but in his version of the story, a whole ecology pullulates beneath the sleek uniformity of the host's thick skin. Its interior structure is a labyrinth of cells and arteries, nerves and organs, structural tubules and struts, a non-homogeneous environment of wet and dry spaces, some cluttered with pulsing conduits and organs, some home to roving organelles, others like the empty caverns formed in foam. That's all a quote from the story. And this is where the genetically refashioned human species takes up residence. Most of the text of the story lovingly recounts the physiology, psychology, and overall life cycle of the new parasitic humanity. The bioengineering is precise and efficient. Everything is optimized in accordance with the physiology and metabolism of the host, and in the interest of flexibility. Anything deemed superfluous to survival is unsentimentally jettisoned. The neo-humans mate quickly, reproduce in great numbers, and litters of 5 or more and mature rapidly. They exhibit both swarm behavior, ganging up together when necessary to overwhelm the host's defenses, and nomadic distribution, scattering themselves throughout the interior of the gargantuan alien to reduce the chances of being all wiped out at once by the host's counterattacks. Once they have killed their host, they go into hibernation within protective vesicles in order to survive the vacuum of deep space until they can encounter another host. In this way, they are able to perpetuate both their genes and their cultural heritage. Since they unavoidably possess a basically non-material culture, they only use lightweight technologies that have been interiorized within their bodies. They are especially gifted with mathematical skill, including a genetically instilled predisposition towards solving abstruse functions in their heads. Aesthetically, they are all masters and lovers of song, the only art form left to the artifact-free neo-humans. Mathematics and music are the sole legacy of 6,000 years of civilization that has been bequeathed to them. The lives of the neo-humans are short and intermittent. They are mayflies, fast-fading blooms, the little creatures of a short hour, yet to themselves their lives still tasted sweet as of old. So I think DeFilippo's story is a kind of allegory of capitalist realism and accelerationism. It's about adapting to being told that there is no alternative, when it no longer seems possible for us to defeat the monstrous invasion or even to imagine things otherwise. This is the best we can do. The neo-humans of phylogenesis evade extinction at the hands of monstrous aliens by devising a situation in which their own survival absolutely depends upon the continuing survival of the monstrosities as well. parasitic neo-humans end up killing whatever host they've invaded, but their continuing proliferation is always contingent upon encountering another host. The extinction of the invaders would mean their own definitive extinction as well. There are traces of how this is a kind of capitalist allegory, even if that's not what De Filippo intended, in every aspect of the story. The downsizing of the neo-humans, adults of 4 feet tall with limbs rather gracile than muscular, the rationalization of their design in the interest of mobility and flexibility, their uncanny coordination and ability to monitor the passage of time with unerring precision, thanks to long-ago modifications in the suprachiasmatic nuclei of their brains, which provided them with accurate biological clocks, the inbuilt determinism by means of which their sexual drives are canalized for a particular purpose, their severely streamlined cultural heritage, and the ways that even their non-productive activities, singing and unprocreative sex, serve a purpose as supreme weapons in the neo-human's army of spirit. Well, those are all quotes from the novel, from the story. All these are recognizable variations of familiar management techniques in the contemporary post-Fordist regime of flexible accumulation. The neo-humans make use of the only tools that they find at hand. They parasitize and mimic the very mechanisms that have dispossessed them. The emotional lives of the neo-humans are effectively streamlined in a post-Fordist manner as well. Feeling an overwhelming sense of loss and aware of all the ways that their potential has been constrained, these people nonetheless conclude that we just have to make the most of the life we have. As for the prospect of those monstrous hosts ever going away, we can't count on it, we can't even dream about it. Both socially and affectively, De Filippo's neo-humans are thus the very image of the multitude invoked by Hart and Negri and Verno, but at the same time they're modeled according to the post-Fordist neoliberal parameters that analysts have seen in contemporary late capitalism, whatever you want to call it. The neo-humans exercise a genuine creativity under extremely straitened circumstances. They produce and themselves enjoy a certain experience of the common. But De Filippo recognizes, perhaps more clearly than theorists of the multitude do, the limitations of any mobilization of the common in our current situation of the real subsumption of labor and life under capitalism. Philogenesis, the story, is a demonstration of a kind of vitalism in spite of capital. But what the story preaches is a kind of resilience, which itself, as the philosopher Robin James has pointed out, is also a kind of neoliberal value. The story begins, life is tenacious, life is ingenious, life is mutable, life is fecund. And there's something inspiring about this, but there's also a sense in which this is about the continuing containment within our contemporary situation. So that seems to be the thinkable version of accelerationism. Thank you.